Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. I'm Felicia Jackson and I'm joined today by my co-host, Heather Dinwoody. Julia, I'm afraid, is still away on holiday, but will be presenting a story for you. As you know, every week we pick 3 stories that tell us something about what's going on in the world of ESG and sustainability. And Heather, can I ask you to kick us off today?
Absolutely. So the story that I was going to chat about today is a survey that has just been done by the National Trust. So basically they posed their questions to 1,000 children across the UK. That's children defined as 7 to 14-year-olds and also 1,000 parents. And what they found was that more than 3/4 of children across the UK would like to spend more time in nature, with 56% specifically asking for more access to nature. At the same time, 63% of the surveyed parents said that they could only take their children into nature once a week at the most, with accessibility being cited as the most common barrier. And it's worth pointing out as well that that was significantly increased among low-income communities. So 80% of the surveyed parents are backing the National Trust in calling for a 15-minute access to be enshrined into law. So this is something that Rishi Sunak and his government promised in January 2023 under their environmental improvement plan. They claimed that they were going to bring 15-minute access into nature into law, and they have not delivered on that commitment. There has also been, and I haven't verified these myself, but there have been documents released by sort of The Guardian and some other publications suggesting that the government never had any intention of doing this. So this has left us in a situation where 38% of people across the UK live more than 15 minutes away from any sort of nature or green space. And 38%, it's not the biggest statistic, but think about that. Think about walking for 15 minutes or more and not seeing any green space, not seeing any trees or anything. You'd realize that it can be quite hard to do. So the fact that 38% of people are living in such a situation is really quite significant, I think. So building on this, the National Trust, as I say, is calling for legal requirement. And Natural England is working with DEFRA to make sure that that requirement is based on walkable routes rather than just calculating sort of a straight line distance. So it looks like we are moving forward with this, but I just think it's a really interesting point to talk about this accessibility to nature, because we know that being in natural spaces is really good for our health, and that's both mental and physical. It's got a whole host of benefits. It also encourages people to care for nature and look after it because they have a better understanding and awareness of the value of nature, the intrinsic value of nature, rather than any sort of monetary sum.
Well, can I just interrupt and say, I think there's something that speaks to the human in all of us. And this is, we can talk about the way the economy is organized, and we can talk about the way capitalism works, and we can talk about the way should do things politically or this, that, and the other. But there's absolutely nothing like the utter joy of being in nature on a beautiful day and just experiencing that in a really just brings joy. I can't think of a better way of putting it. And there's too little of that in our lives today.
That's exactly it. And, there's so much research to back that, to back the health benefits, which, if you think about it, even in the crudest of terms, that actually does have the economic benefit of, say, reducing the burden on the NHS and everything, which, is pretty topical at the moment. So I definitely think there's so many benefits to be gained. And also because this would sort of necessitate creating more green space and natural spaces. So it does also have those environmental benefits. And I'm interested in how this might sort of be impacted by the recent introduction of Biodiversity Net Gain requirements in the UK, because this is a new legal requirement whereby developers will be required to leave at least 10% greater biodiversity in the surrounding area than when they began their project. And that in itself is going to sort of create more nature. And I think that could really sort of play hand in hand with this new policy. But I do think that enshrining this into law means that the government can be held accountable in a way that it hasn't previously.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting part. I also think it fits in to this concept of the 15-minute city, which has had lots of support and been attacked because it's seen as a way of, I suppose it's woke urban planning. I'm not really sure what to call it. But it is this idea that, as people, we should be able to access necessities and services. And nature's part of that. But it means, building in a way that's not just long roads connecting A to B, but that actually you can walk to work, you can walk to healthcare. I remember during COVID, there was lots of stuff in the early days about going to testing, and the places that were available for testing, you had to have a car to get there. What do you do if you don't have a car? That could be because you can't afford a car. It could be because you don't want to have a car because you think it's damaging, but you're being prevented from accessing healthcare because you don't drive. And it might sound a bit silly to make an analogy between the two, but I actually think it's really closely interconnected. We don't think about how all the different parts of our lives play into each other. And I think we do have to start thinking about how we build the world in which we live in a different way.
You've reminded me of a really interesting kind of case study I came across, but unfortunately I can't remember many of the details.
That's always a shame.
Last year I had the opportunity to go to the Eco City Summit in London, and I went to a presentation that was about sort of greening hospitals, and it might have been Great Ormond Street. It was a children's hospital somewhere where they'd done all this really impressive work to sort of increase the amount of nature in the surrounding area. And yeah, it was about making sure that you could walk healthily to these hospitals, because they'd originally done some research that found that this street, it had one of the worst air quality in the UK, and they were like, this is a hospital, this doesn't match up. So then they'd then done all this work to create lovely green spaces and seating areas, and it was a really grassroots project, taking the insights of the community. And I think that's so important, especially when, as this research from the National Trust has shown, accessibility is differentiated by social income. Social income? You know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. But I think it's one of those things that's really difficult to talk about, because actually, if you don't have as much money, you seem to be penalised in terms of access to fresh food and fresh air and nature and healthcare and jobs. The way we design things just doesn't seem to be fit for purpose.
Absolutely. And I think there's a related concept sort of known as green gentrification, which talks about the fact that although some local authorities are really thinking about nature now, they are tending to focus on the wealthier areas. And it's just really important that we use the tools available. And there are tools available. I remember writing about a sort of database kind of thing where it collected socioeconomic data and then compared that with tree coverage in urban spaces. And it's really interesting how we can use all this data available to us to make sure that we're making equal, accessible, healthy environments for everyone.
Okay, I'm going to use that as an opportunity to step onto my story, because it's this business of the just transition, of being fair, of taking advantage of the knowledge and the technologies and the information that we have in order to build a better, fairer society, in order to do things like ensure there's increased greenery in poorer areas so that it addresses air pollution, all this kind of thing. And weirdly, I'm going to do it by talking about Larry Fink. And if you don't know who he is, he basically runs BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager. And he's become quite well known in the world of finance, and in fact beyond, because of his annual letter to shareholders. And the reason this has become such a thing is because you can really take the temperature on what's happening in the capital markets by the sorts of things that he talks about. So his annual letter to shareholders is almost a bellwether for, how we're looking at the world. And it was actually back in 2018 when he first said that in order to prosper over time, companies need not only to deliver financial performance, but to show how they make a positive contribution to society. So in a way, with Heather's story, we're talking about the state's responsibility to act. And this is about companies' responsibility to act, but they're interconnected. You just have to look at what's the big scandal. Sorry, shouldn't use the word scandal. The issue at the moment around Thames Water and the amount of money that was taken out of the business by shareholders in dividends. And now I think current investors are saying that increasing the cost of water by 40% is going to be insufficient to justify them putting further money into the business. Now, that is, to me, a symbol of the failure of the relationship between regulators, investors, shareholders, because no normal person can afford a 40, 50, 60% increase in their water bills. But there's this huge gap in investment in making the water system resilient. Anyway, I got off topic. I do that all the time. I'm sorry. But the point about this is financial return is important, but you have to make a positive contribution too. Now, in 2020, Larry Fink's letter said that sustainability was going to be at the center of BlackRock's investment approach. With everything that's going on with the politicization of ESG and that approach, he's now said, I think in 2023, he said that he's not going to use the term ESG, that it's been weaponized. And actually, in his 2024 letter, he barely mentioned ESG at all. And now the letter talks about sustainable investing, and it talks about the importance of energy infrastructure and energy pragmatism, whatever that's meant to mean. And there's a lot of talk about the importance of capital markets and how, the capital markets are the best way to invest for retirement. But what it doesn't do is talk about the weaknesses of capital markets. And that is where you're failing to integrate positive benefits with financial return. It's totally failing to engage with this. I mean, I call it a fact. The idea that financial return does not deal with the externalities of business operation. It doesn't talk about the damage that's done by greenhouse gas emissions or by failing to invest in infrastructure. And I know that there are issues in Europe as well. I mean, in Europe, the concern is much more about regulation and the terminology and whether sustainable investment funds are actually sustainable or not. But in the US, it's become this political issue that you can't talk about ESG. I think there's a couple of states where BlackRock itself is being sued because it tried to be sustainable in its investment planning. That to me is really, really challenging, because one thing that BlackRock continues to talk about is the megatrends that are shaping society, that is shaping the capital markets themselves. Now, one of them is actually quite positive. It's emerging global wealth. But the other four are a lot more challenging. So technological breakthrough, it could be really, really positive, but also technological breakthrough could also be AI and people losing jobs left, right, and centre. There's rapid urbanisation. That's the mass migration of people moving from places where they can't actually afford, they can't work, they can't make a living. They're often moving to cities. That means we're going to need new business models. It means we're going to need new infrastructure. And it means the megatrend of climate change and resource scarcity is going to have a much more significant impact, I think, than a lot of us are prepared to accept. And at the same time, we've got this issue of people are living longer, medicine is changing, we've got longer lifespans, but, the number of children being born around the world is different in different countries. There's real demographic change, and all of these different things are going to come together. They're going to affect the way in which economies thrive. They're going to affect the way in which people function and succeed. And we've got to actually start taking seriously an integrated approach to how we make choices as businesses, how we make choices as states, and how we make choices as people. And I actually think one of the things that I did like about Fink's letter this year was this idea about energy pragmatism. Now, I think a lot of people reading that might take that as support for the refocus on fossil fuels, the idea that you need to ensure that you have a secure supply of energy. But I actually think energy pragmatism is about making choices you need to make. And that's in terms of what's going to be available, what impact that particular choice of fuel makes on the wider world. I think it's very interesting that the Shell appeal against the Dutch ruling on its need to cut emissions just has just started, that's going to become part of a wider conversation. And I think as these conversations get more mainstream, we're going to have to make a lot of more complex choices. And I actually think that's a good thing. We talk a lot, I think, about nuance and about how we need to understand the different drivers of choices over time. And, people can make decisions and do their best, and it may not be exactly what you want, but you've got to move it forward. But I think two things come out of this for me. I think the way we use language is incredibly important. And I think it defines the way we think about what's possible and what's reasonable and what's necessary. But I suppose we also have to have the flexibility of ensuring that we take the way in which language is used and we make it work for us. So, I just think there's a lot about communications that comes out of this that is really important. And I think a lot of companies are going to have to think long and hard about not only what they do, but how they talk about it.
So you know how much I love talking about language. This is just, I am my mother's daughter on this one, frankly. And I do think it's absolutely fascinating that the term ESG has been so demonized. And yet I wonder how many people will read Fink's letter, will read about these 5 mega trends with climate, will read about energy, will read about all of these things, and they'll be like, oh, well, I mean, yes, this all seems in order, just because the term ESG is barely used. And, I hate to say it, but it's probably quite a staggering difference just by the wording that he uses. Now, I will admit, I have not read this letter. I'm going off of what you've told me. But, I mean, I think, okay, so he's not spoken about it. But from what you're saying, it sounds like he has discussed some of the risks involved when he's talking about these 5 mega trends and everything. Like, he is.
Well, that's not actually in the letter, but that is a fundamental underpinning of BlackRock's approach. And to be honest, the reason I think it's so important is I don't believe there's an asset manager out there or a ratings provider or a debt provider who doesn't understand that these trends, these are big changes that are affecting every economy everywhere in the world.
Well, I mean, frankly, any asset manager that doesn't take these things into consideration, they're not going to survive. Like, they're not going to be around forever, because as you've said, these changes in the climate and demographic changes, all of these changes, they're happening. Whether we like it or not, they are happening. So for an asset manager to ignore them would just be absolutely foolish. So the big asset managers that we're looking to for advice, or not advice, maybe sort of to understand what these trends in investment are, the ones that are doing well are going to be the ones that are considering these things. But you're right, it's about how they are talking about it. I will also say, just because I've been hung up on this since you mentioned it, and I know it was a tangent, but I want to reply with my own tangent. Thames water. I will just say that I come from the beautiful region of Scotland where water is nationalised. I believe it is in Northern Ireland as well, and I'm just going to advocate for that system. Anyhow, back to you.
On that note, maybe we should go to our third story.
Okie dokie. So for our third story, which I'm going to discuss on Julia's behalf, is about procurement. So this was a survey by SEDEX, which is a sort of sustainable supply chain company in Northern America. So they surveyed 250 senior procurement leaders from across the US and Canada and came to the worrying conclusion that 40% didn't consider sustainability at all when making their procurement decisions. And that rises to about 50% when you include people who said, oh, well, it might be an afterthought. Only 28% said that sustainability was central to their procurement decisions. And this is a massive contrast to the 90% of Russell 1000 companies, which are the largest public listed US companies, of which 90% produce ESG reports and have sustainability goals, and yet among their procurement leaders, sustainability barely seems to be a factor. 34% said they saw no benefit, and
I don't understand.
37% were unaware of how upcoming legislation might impact their company around sustainability.
How is that possible?
And, well, I mean, it's just, it's mind-blowing, really. And this brings me back. It reminds me of the conversation that we had last week about the need to break down silos within companies. Well, within and beyond company boundaries, because procurement is central to any sustainability goals because it's about supply chain, which is where the vast majority of not only a company's carbon emissions, but also just its environmental impact more generally. The resources that are being stripped, the land conversion, all these kinds of things, those factor into procurement.
But even at the most basic level, compliance with regulation. I don't understand how the legal team can't see that as an issue, how the risk management team can't see that as an issue. And surely they should be talking to the procurement officers about it.
Well, you would think, and it seems like they just aren't. And it just completely blows my mind that such a massive portion of any company's environmental/climate impact is going to be coming from procurement and from their supply chain. And yet you'll have a sustainability department in one room and a procurement team in the other. And this is exactly what I was talking about last week, where it's like, could you just speak to one another? Because you need to have, if you're going to took these big goals and put out your ESG reports and commit to your net zeros, you really, really need to have your procurement team on board. And not just your procurement team, you need to have your marketing team on board, you need to have your sales team on board, you need to have everyone on board. And in terms of legislation, a lot of companies have legal teams. And you just think, surely, I hope that their legal teams are aware of upcoming sustainability legislation.
But also, think about it. Even if we're going to move beyond compliance and regulation and legislation, I would think the finance department would want to say, because, we've just been discussing the increased price of chocolate because of the issues in cocoa farming. If your materials are going to rapidly increase in price, don't you need to know that? Don't you need to reduce waste in order, again, to save money? I'm not even saying this from an ESG point of view. This is just basic business sense. Cut waste, cut energy use, work out where your materials are coming from, what's at risk, how can you replace it, how can you make it more circular?
Well, this survey really blew my mind because it just makes you wonder how many companies are going to suddenly hit a critical point where everything falls apart for them.
Yeah.
Because whether you're talking about this from business sense or from an environmental perspective, no matter which way you talk about this, it's a problem. It's a real, real problem.
Yeah.
You might get fined. You might find that you can't source any of your raw materials. You might have shareholders withdraw.
Or you know what? You'll be competing with your biggest rivals.
Yeah, the very basic things. And it's like, if you just had a weekly meeting where you had the leader of each team in one room and just sort of had a little update, and these things must happen. Am I completely alone in thinking that people need to know what's going on with the rest of the company?
It does seem quite a logical ask, but I'm wondering how much of it is to do with language and people thinking, well, that's not an issue, that's just a political thing, I'm not going to worry about it. Because I do remember seeing something last year, I think it was a Deloitte thing about procurement, and they were saying that less than half of organisations actually, for procurement purposes, actually define or measure their own set of ESG factors. And maybe it's that ESG is seen as, oh no, or sustainability, what do we mean by that? Or climate change, what do we mean by that? Because I agree with you, people should be in a room talking to each other. But if within the company it's not considered to be something important or a priority, why would they think about getting together? So maybe it's the language we use and we need to change the way we talk about things.
Maybe, but frankly, it just makes me want to get in there and bang people's heads together. I apologise for getting so exasperated about this, but it just seems so stupid, frankly. Ignorant, oblivious. Pick your word. It's not complimentary.
I can't disagree with you. But I think perhaps what it says is that we need to think more clearly about how we communicate what matters most. But at the same time, I believe the phrase "wake up and smell the coffee" comes to mind, because the coffee's going to be priced out of use as well.
Oh, don't
That's
say
a little
that.
bit of a concern.
As you can probably tell, I've already had a few this morning. You can't take that away from me. You pick your battles.
On that note, I think I'm going to draw our chat to a close. Thanks for joining me, Heather, and we'll be back soon with our interview with EPR. Today, we're lucky enough to be being joined by Ben Kite, the Group Strategy Director of Ecology Consultancy, EPR, and we're going to be talking more about Biodiversity Net Gain. Hi, Ben. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about EPR, what you do, and why does it matter?
Good morning, Felicia. Certainly. Yes. So EPR is an ecological consultancy that was founded in 1989 by the former county ecologist of Hampshire, Phil Colborne. We've got about 35 staff now, based in several offices around the country, but still headquartered in Hampshire. Essentially, what we do is provide advice to any organisations, whether that's local planning authorities, developers, infrastructure delivery groups, anybody who is engaging with the land use planning process. And what we try to do is to help them make better decisions about what they want to do with land. Can bring about better outcomes for nature conservation, basically, in the natural environment, and that helps their projects as well, because it helps them have a swifter path to consent. It helps them with reputation, PR, and just sort of corporate social responsibility, doing the right thing. So hopefully, if we get it right, it's good for the environment and good for people.
Well, what's really exciting for me about what you are doing at EPR is how it relates to Biodiversity Net Gain. So we have already had a discussion on the podcast about, what Biodiversity Net Gain is in terms of understanding the physical data. But can you explain what it is, why it matters, and, of course, the all-important question for a business audience, how it's an opportunity as well as a compliance necessity?
Sure. Well, for years, for most of my career, in fact, the planning system aimed to achieve no net loss in planning decisions that were made. So when a planning application was granted consent, the position that the planning system was supposed to have got to was that there was no net loss of biodiversity. Now, that doesn't really work at scale as a strategy, because it only takes one or two projects to think they've achieved no net loss and to fail to deliver that. And then the planning system as a whole has resulted in a net loss of biodiversity. And really, sort of, we've been faced as a country and as a society with some very stark statistics on biodiversity decline. So the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, for example, publishes annual biodiversity indicators for the UK, and they've been in free fall for some time. If you look at the abundance of priority species, the condition of triple SIs, typical bellwethers of the health of the countryside, like farmland bird diversity and abundance, for example, they've all been in free fall since certainly strong freefall since the 70s at least, but before that, in actual fact, even before the data started getting collected. So the planning system really is contributing to that decline, and it doesn't need to. There are ways of doing things better that mean that land use planning can be an opportunity to drive the recovery of nature where planning decisions are made. And that's where biodiversity net gain comes in. So this shifts the emphasis in the planning system away from no net loss of biodiversity and into net gain. Effectively, what it means is that in order to get your consent, so if you're caught by the biodiversity net gain regulations and the provisions of the Environment Act that relate to biodiversity net gain, so that's most major development under the Town and Country Planning Act at the moment. It will eventually extend to cover smaller sites and nationally significant infrastructure projects, and then possibly after that other forms of delivery order as well, such as local development orders. But effectively, what's being asked of them is that they leave more biodiversity than there was on site before the development happened, and that's in order to quantify and make that objective rather than simply a subjective judgment, that's done using a metric, which DEFRA have designed, a biodiversity metric, which uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity, as a proxy measure. Now, that's logical because it's not possible to measure every single living organism in an area of land. It would be a lifetime study, or several lifetimes worth of study to do that. The way it works is that different habitats are known to be biodiverse at different levels and to have different importance for biodiversity in terms of whether they are irreplaceable, whether they're a critical natural capital, or whether the low end of the spectrum is what's called constant natural assets. So they're things that can be easily replaced within a human lifetime, and they're common and abundant in the landscape. So the metric effectively ranks and prioritizes and gives weight to the more valuable, the more biodiverse, the more important habitats, and it converts the habitats that are present on a site before development. Once they're all mapped and categorized, you put that data into the metric, and it will tell you how many biodiversity units you've got on your development site before the development happens. It's a simplified common measure. And then you do the same for the predicted outcome once the developments happen. So you map all the habitats that you expect to be present, you put that data into the metric, and it'll tell you how many biodiversity units you anticipate having on site after the development. And effectively what the Environment Act does is it asks for at least a minimum of a 10% uplift in biodiversity units between the pre-development situation and the post-development situation. And if you can't deliver that within your red line, what you have to do is pay somebody off-site to deliver it for you. And there's a whole series of rules about how that's done. There's a hierarchy, a biodiversity net gain hierarchy and a mitigation hierarchy that have to be followed, have to be gone through. And there's a whole manual as to how of complexity as to how that works. It's obviously grossly oversimplifies reality because the natural environment is a very complicated system. But what it does do is make it simple enough that it can be consistently applied at scale in planning decisions. So it can't be applied in the absence of ecological judgment, but as a tool, it helps to drive better outcomes. That's the idea.
So in a sense, it's a starting point for us to be able to start measuring and protecting natural capital and biodiversity.
That's the idea. I mean, although I have to admit I have mixed feelings about it because people like me have been trying to persuade society to protect the natural environment for years because it's important for our existence and our well-being, but it's also something, it's a complicated, beautiful system that we don't really understand. And to quote Aldo Leopold, that the first precaution of intelligent tinkering is to keep every cog and wheel. But we have to accept that we've failed. That pleading with people in that way hasn't worked. So we've got to try things differently. And in modern society, in our sort of transaction, capital-driven, materialistic world, you've got to be able to speak that language in order to give the natural environment the weight that it deserves in decisions. And that's what this is attempting to do, really. It's attempting to recognise the value of natural features and natural capital and make sure that it's taken into account when decisions are made.
Now, and that's fascinating because obviously one of the big conversations in climate finance, for example, is the use of carbon credits to try and funnel funds and capital towards mitigation and adaptation. But a biodiversity unit can't be the same as a carbon credit because with carbon dioxide, wherever you emit it, it has the same effect on the atmosphere. But surely with biodiversity, it's completely situation and geography specific. So how does that work?
Yeah, so you can't you can't propose to create habitats that have got no chance of being made manifest. That's why the metric is a dumb tool. It's a blunt tool. It needs to be applied with ecological judgment, and there are benefits for making sound ecological judgment when you apply it. So, for example, there are things being written now called local nature recovery strategies, which specify which habitats are locally desirable in a particular area for biodiversity, and that's based on lots of input from nature conservation groups, from regulators, from people involved in the conservation scene. Basically, they help to write these as part of a nature partnership. And if your development is proposing to create a habitat that is sought by that local nature recovery strategy, then it benefits from positive multipliers in the DEFRA metric. And conversely, if you're causing the loss of those habitats, then additional penalties are applied. There's a strategic aspect to the metric in that it's trying to do the right thing in the right place, but also it does rely on adequate expertise being used in the application of it. Because if you propose, for example, a calcareous grassland on sand and gravel that can only manifest an acid grassland, then the metric doesn't know that. It'll still give you the credit for what you're proposing. So it does rely on the ecologist inputting the data into metric to know what they're talking about and know that it's possible. And it also relies on adequate scrutiny in local authorities. So the local authority ecologist has to go through these spreadsheets and say, hang on a minute, that's not going to work and send it back, basically, and go through that iterative process until the outcome, the right outcome is achieved that everyone has agreed is feasible.
That sounds like a hell of a lot of work. And I mean, how many ecologists are around who actually are able to do that kind of work?
Not enough, to be honest with you. They're at the last sort of check, I think only 1 in 3 local authorities had an in-house ecologist. Most of them bought their ecological advice in from other places, for service agreements from county ecology teams, for example, or consultancies. The sector's doing everything it can to ramp up the level of expertise. I mean, CIME, my institute, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, has a Green Jobs for Nature programme, and it's been liaising with DEFRA to try to find ways to accelerate recruitment and training, find new routes into the sector for late career changes and non-degree holders and that kind of thing, and ramp it up really quite significantly. It's a challenge for the sector, there's no doubt about that. But it's one that we've got to rise to, I think. The action that's required on the environment has got to the point now where it is urgent. And something needs to be done. So I think it's a case of the sector. The sector has to expand and train and rise to the challenge. I don't see any other way forward, really.
I mean, obviously that does sound like a challenge, but one of the flip sides of that is it's also an opportunity for people to actually find their way into an entirely new area of work. So that actually, for me, is quite exciting.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, when I began my career, quite often you were a distressed purchase for the developers that engaged you, and they instructed you because they needed you to get their planning consent, and they didn't really appreciate the fact that you were there. Your name sort of tended to appear down the bottom of the agenda in design team meetings, just above any other business. But that has completely changed over the course of my career, and I think. We're now, ecology and natural environment professionals are now seen as really important placemakers. So they add something to the character of a place that makes it worth living in. There is a green premium recognised now in the sector that homes built in attractive naturalistic green environments are desirable and they command high prices as a result. So you get that right, you get your landscaping and your ecology right, and actually you can make more money and produce a better place that does more for the well-being and the lives of the people that then live there. And I think it's wonderful to see that importance is becoming recognised in the land use sector, and there's far more collaboration going on between built environment professionals, planners, architects, and those that specialise in the natural environment. The synergy between the two is coming to the fore, and that's. I wish that had happened earlier in my career, but I'm just pleased to see it happening.
That is a very, very positive thing. And I think that brings up one of those questions that really interest me. We've got all this focus growing on the need for biodiversity and nature protection, in large part because of climate change and our need to take action on sort of building resilience in the natural world. So how does what's happening with the BNG relate to an overall picture of the UK's ecosystem health?
Well, it's a part of it. It only affects the planning world. So new planning applications for projects. And something like 70% of land thereabouts is agricultural, rather than being development's a relatively small part of the overall land use picture. So this has to work it's not going to work on its own. It has to work in tandem with, the emerging subsidy schemes for farmers like ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, for example. But it interrelates with those sorts of subsidy systems. So a farmer or a landowner can look at their land and say, well, I want to do this activity here, here, and here. I can get an ELMS grant to help me do this bit of work on that. This bit of land's more marginal. It's less useful for me to farm food, and therefore I can turn that into a biodiversity net gain site. I can design a habitat package with an ecologist and talking to people like Natural England, the local authority. I can get that registered on the public register of net gain sites, and then I can sell those biodiversity units to a developer, and that can be an extra income from me. And actually, if it's done right, what it should do is make money available to all the landowners who would have loved to have done nicer things with their land for nature conservation, but just couldn't make it work financially. It provides an income stream to incentivize those things, and it makes marginal land that's not agriculturally productive an opportunity rather than a constraint, rather than a drawback on their land holding. So hopefully, it's only a small part of the overall picture. But if it doesn't become siloed thinking in all these sectors, if they're all joined up properly, which is obviously the intention, then it should be positive overall.
Now, I mean, that's a brilliant picture of how things should evolve for the UK as a whole. You mentioned the possibility of how this is a process of how it could evolve. But you mentioned that at the moment, certainly with BNG, it's focused on planning. Which companies need to start looking at biodiversity net gain today?
It's a range of organisations, really. Obviously, anybody building anything significant needs to engage with it now, because they're likely to be caught by the biodiversity net gain planning condition, which requires this. So house builders, infrastructure delivery organisations. The regulators obviously need to engage with it. Natural England and local planning authorities will have a role in scrutinising planning applications, but also they may be landowners themselves. So local planning authorities often own lots of land. Some of it is not delivering the public benefits that it should do or could do. And it may be a cost rather than an income stream. So, a lot of local authorities are now reviewing their land holdings and saying, what land do we own? Could this be a biodiversity net gain site? And if so, they can design a habitat creation strategy for that land and sell units to developers in their district, and do something positive for the natural environment, but also help speed the delivery of development, because they're offering those developers a way to quickly meet their obligations and comply with their biodiversity net gain expectation. There's also nature conservation organisations, so they own a lot of land, could own more. They can tap into this as well and that'll provide extra income to do things on their nature reserves that they couldn't afford to do before. But landowners of all shapes and sizes, really, whether it's a farmer, whether it's a golf course, whether it's a parkland estate. This doesn't have to be a substitute for whatever it is that people are doing with the land now. It can work around the edges of it, or be blended and dovetailed with it. So you can take a field, for example, that's being grazed by cattle, and decide that there's scope to plant up new hedges around the edge, new species-rich hedges. There might be scope to put a pond in the corner. There might be a scope to change the species-poor, agriculturally improved grassland into a species-rich, wildflower-rich grassland, and still graze it with the cattle. So it doesn't necessarily need to displace other beneficial uses of the land if it's done intelligently. And you look at the land and say, and this is the exciting thing, I think, really, you look at the land and say, what is the potential of this land? How can it do the most good for its owner and for society? And it might be that some of it's best left to produce food, some of it can produce biodiversity, some of it can attenuate floodwater, some of it can sequester carbon, and this is all part of the sort of the idea of public money for public goods, really. But it takes it beyond that into private money, and hopefully, if it's done right, and there's bound to be teething problems of all sorts. Embedding any new system, there's always problems, but the potential is quite exciting, I think.
Honestly, it sounds amazing when you talk about it. This idea of sort of enriching nature and the opportunities to do better with what we've already got in a way that funnels both public and private money into making the world a better place to live just sounds like an amazing opportunity.
I mean, there's fantastic data coming out of the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, for example, at the moment, which shows that a lot of the data that's used for carbon sequestration calculations typically relates to the top sort of 10 centimetres or so of soil. And that's important because some of the habitats that are the best at sequestering carbon sometimes are quite shallow. They might be over rock or impermeable layers. Whereas in the floodplain, typical floodplain meadow forbs root down to 2 meters or more. So although the density of carbon sequestration per unit volume of soil might not be as much as other habitats, once you've taken into account the 2 meter depth, you've got an extraordinary carbon sequestration potential across the UK in floodplains. By doing things like restoring species-rich wildflower meadows, and the potential to benefit biodiversity by doing that, as well as carbon sequestration, is huge because some of the nicer grasslands in the country, some of the relict species-rich floodplain meadows that would have existed before the advent of modern agrochemicals can have 60 or more species per metre squared. And if you look at a modern lawn, you might get sort of 5 to 10 species of wildflower, and there'll be common things like daisies and dandelions. So if you imagine the boost that can provide to pollinators, the benefit to wildlife in general of having so much more insect biomass, food for birds, etc. And also you can graze, they're best grazed. Lowland floodplain hay meadows are managed typically by beef cattle grazing, so you can get food out of them as well, and you can massively increase the carbon sequestration potential. So if we're smart about how we use land and we provide the right incentives to landowners to make it possible for them to take a risk, really, and depart from this established traditions and dogmas and try something new, we give them some money to help them do that, then we might just unleash the potential that we really need.
That is just such an incredibly wonderful and positive moment on which to leave this. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. It's been absolutely fascinating. For our listeners, for anyone who wants to know more about EPR or get in touch with Ben, the details will be in the show notes. Don't forget to like and subscribe, to follow the podcast, and we will be back with you soon.